Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Freshman Fundamentals. Today we're talking about practice room technique. Don't worry though, you're not going to have to just hear from me. Today we have a very special interview with one of the professors from the University of Arkansas. This is Dr. Timothy Thompson. He's actually one of my professors. He coached one of my brass quintets, and it's a pleasure working with him. So I wanted to talk to him a little bit about just practice room technique and ways that we can stay effective while we're in the practice room. Um, and he's been working at the University of Arkansas since 1979. He's taught horn in North Carolina and Wisconsin, as well as several festivals. So it's safe to say that he's worked with a lot of students. So I guess my first question for you would be, when you have a student that's really excelling in your studio, what are the kinds of things that are really setting them apart?
If I had to put it in a word, we all like to do that, it would be initiative. And initiative is a complicated word that means a lot of things, but basically just your own personal initiative. Talent is a great thing. I've always in my life kind of wondered exactly what talent means. I guess it's one of those things. It's like someone said about great art. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. So I guess when you're dealing with somebody talented, and that's fine. But there is absolutely no substitute for initiative. So what does that mean? Part of it, first of all, is passion. Is just that you really love what you're doing. Some people love performing in music because they love making music. Some people like the technical challenge. Some people like the life. The traveling down the road and going on trips and that kind of thing. Whatever it is, you really need to have a passion for it. If you don't, you probably won't be successful. And even if you are, you probably won't really enjoy it very much. Initiative, hard work, just really, really hard work. Just deciding right from the beginning that that you love this enough and are willing to sacrifice enough to really put the hours in, and not just half an hour a day, not just 4 hours a day once a week, not just hitting it hard and heavy right before juries and then taking the rest of the time off, but really putting a lot of time into it. There's a lot of theories about whether somebody has to just eat, live, and breathe their instrument. And I might like to talk about that a little bit more later on, kind of smelling the roses kind of an idea. But I'll be honest, I'll be perfectly honest. The people that I know that are the big, big, big names in this business are the kind of people who really have no other life. I mean, it doesn't mean they're not interesting people. Musically, they're very interesting people, their work circumstances and all that. But they really just don't have a lot else going on because they're just utterly dedicated to what they're doing. And most of them have been since they were in high school. I admire that. And I admit that that's how you get to be, a member of the Berlin Philharmonic or a member of the New York Philharmonic or whatever. But most of us mere mortals don't really fall into that category. And so I find it more interesting in my teaching to find someone who's really passionate about what they're doing, really willing to put in the hard work, and at the same time really encourage them to relax every now and then. Don't let yourself get crazy. Don't let yourself get overwrought about it. Take a day off every now and then and go out and take a hike and that sort of thing. My teachers taught me that, and it was a good lesson.
Speaking of your teachers, who do you think had the biggest impact on not only your playing but also your teaching style? And if they had one big piece of advice, what do you think that was?
Most of us will tell you that the big formative influences in our life were our degree professors. Occasionally somebody will say it was 2 lessons with, first horn in the Chicago Symphony, or it was the summer festival, and those things are really inspiring. And I really, really, really encourage my students to do those kinds of ancillary studies. But most of us are really, who we are is pretty much molded by who our undergraduate and our graduate teachers were. And my undergraduate teacher, whose name was Boris Ribka at the University of North Carolina, and my graduate teacher, Douglas Hill at the University of Wisconsin, were very, very different people and very, very different kinds of musicians. But they had some core attributes that I really learned a lot from. For one thing, they were both very, very passionate about being musicians. Not just playing music, but loving music. Boris was the kind that would roll his eyes in the back of his head and grab his chest and moan when he heard something really beautiful. Doug was a person who just understood and loved all kinds of music. They both were very, very passionate about that. And they were both, by the way, really great players in their day. So they knew the business, they knew the folks, they knew the contacts, they knew the lifestyles. And they really loved the life. But another thing is that they were both very good diagnosticians. And I know that one of the things you want to get into in a little bit is some practice room technique. And that one of the things that I really emphasize in practice room technique is taking care of the mechanical and also taking care of the musical. And that was one of the things that both Boris and Doug were really good at, was that in spite of the fact that they both had this overriding passion for music, they understood that ultimately muscles and air make the horn blow. And they were both extremely good. Boris was good at finding a problem and giving me exercises and etudes and repertoire, guiding me through the actual stuff I played to get me from point A to point B. Doug was good at that also, but what he was particularly good at was just physiologically analyzing what's going on. I mean, he's a guy who is sort of an original hippie. You know, he just loves music, and he wants you to be yourself, and he wants to, you know, all this. But at the same time, he could point to your face and say, you need to move that muscle right there a little bit more. Or he would say, you know, you need to raise your tongue 1.5 millimeters. So both of those were people who the end goal was to make gorgeous music, but they realized you have to have the technical ability to make that happen. And they were both really good in their own ways at showing me how to do that.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that they were really good at kind of towing the line between those two things, which can sometimes kind of combat each other. So how do you strike that balance between music and the more, I guess, mechanical technique aspects in the practice room on your own?
Let me tell you a little story. I know I don't want to get too long-winded, but one of the things that I wanted to say about my teachers was they also taught me learn from everything. Learn from everything you can learn from. You know, you don't just have to learn from horn players. A horn player can learn from a tuba player. We can learn to breathe from a singer. We can learn to make music from a cellist. But they were also very, very clear that, you know, you should take time to smell the roses. You should enjoy your life. And they both knew that I had a lot of outside interests, and they really encouraged those. And basically they said, learn from everything. So I'll tell you a little story, but because first of all, it informs how I teach this concept of technique in music, but also because it sort of plays on that idea of learn from everybody, learn from everything you can. So all of our listeners, young and old, will know who Harrison Ford is. He was on Solo. But yeah, hopefully know that. But a lot of people won't know who Charlie Rose is. Charlie Rose is a person who had an interview show on public TV for a long time. And he was very good at interviewing people in a very, very downplayed, low-key circumstance. You know, you didn't have the bands, you didn't have the sidekicks. It was just Charlie and who he was interviewing. And he was interviewing Harrison Ford one time, and he said, you know, Harrison, you have this extraordinary body of work. You know, you've been in the blockbuster movies like Star Wars, and you've been in the cutting edge like Blade Runner, and you've been in the art films like Sabrina, and you've been just such an artist. And Harrison Ford just chopped him off right in mid-sentence. And I don't know if anybody out there has ever really heard Harrison Ford talk when he wasn't playing a role, but he's very gruff. He's very straightforward. And he just cut Charlie Rose off, and he said, I want to make something really clear. He said, I don't know anything about art. I'm not an artist. He said, when I go up to the movie set, the artist is the director. They have the vision. I have the craft to make that happen. I don't know anything about art. I know a lot about craft. And my first reaction to that was I wanted to get mad and turn the TV off, because I thought, what a jerk. And then my next reaction was, keeping in mind, my teacher said, you can learn from anything. My next reaction was to say, well, how sad, you know, this guy who's been a part of all these great artistic ventures doesn't see it as art. But then the next thing, I finally calmed down a little bit, and I said to myself, now, this is interesting, because, and by the way, I'd already been experimenting with some of these things in the practice room anyway. But I thought, this is interesting, because Ford thinks of that there's craft, and then that there's art, and that he can only provide the craft, and that the director can only provide the art. I would feel sad if I thought that was my situation, you know, if I felt like I can only provide one or the other. But I thought, it is interesting, you know, because you do have art, but you do have to be able to create it. And whereas Ford's idea of this was the director is the artist and the actor is the technician, I thought, what I will try to do is to be both, the craftsman and the artist. But I do understand, as much as I didn't like his attitude, his idea that you can't be both at once. His way of not being both at once is he's the craftsman, George Lucas is the artist.
So
My way of
one, yeah.
Yeah, and just chooses one and goes in one direction or the other, which may be true for movies and acting for all I know. But my way of dealing with this was to say, okay, I'm a good musician, or at least I'm a passionate musician. I study music. I know music. I know what I want, but I don't always have the chops to make it happen, either because I have my limitations or because I just haven't really developed that craft just yet. And so I've developed this kind of four-pronged approach to learning a piece. The first approach is what I call creative slop. And that sounds like I'm being silly, but I'm not. I mean exactly what it says. You have a piece you haven't seen before, maybe haven't heard it before, slop through it. Don't try to create your magnum opus, excuse me, the first time you go through a piece. In fact, I don't think it's a good idea. Have fun, fool around with it. Play till you run down, and then start there, and play till you run down and start there. Play through a big phrase and have a good time. And I tell students this is where sometimes you might want to take a piece of paper and put it over the window in your practice room, because you don't want people to know it's you, because you're just slopping through. The problem is most of us, if we're not careful, never get past creative slop. We basically continue to practice that way until the recital. And for me, creative slop lasts 30 seconds, a day, 2 days, long enough to just sort of get to know the piece. Then, in my way of learning pieces, you really have to sit down and say, what do I want to make in art? And that should be the first thing, because if you're not in it for the music, you're in the wrong business. Think about the piece, listen to the piece, sing it in your head, play through things, experiment with the big crescendo or the light tongue or the huge retard or the exciting accelerando. Then stop, turn the switch, go get a drink of water, come back and say to yourself, now how do I do that? How do I make that happen? Because simply wanting it to happen isn't necessarily going to make it happen. Some things are going to come really quickly. Some things you're just going to have the chops for, and boom, it's done. Some things you're going to say, let's say it's a fast passage, and you say, well, I want this at 120. I can play it at 96. And so, it's not something that comes instantly, but you get the metronome on every day. You go up 2 metronome marks. A week or two down the road, you're in business. But some things are going to be things that you can't do. Maybe you have in mind this heroic crescendo and you just don't have the air for it yet. Or maybe you got an extremely rapid passage and you can say you can play it fast enough, but with a really heavy tongue, and you want to learn to do it with a light tongue. I could give 1,000 different examples, but something that's just way more problematic at the moment than some of the other things. So now you have an interesting dilemma, which is you have to say to yourself, first of all, is it worth it? Is it worth the time to go back and figure out how to do this? Let's use tonguing as an example. You've got a really fast, heavy tongue, but you're playing some French solo and you want a really much lighter tongue. Do you really want to go back and take the time that it will take? Because it'll take a lot of time to go back and learn the tongue in a different manner. Well, the first answer to that question should be yes, even if you've decided that you don't necessarily want to do it in the solo. Because if you can't do it, you can't do it, and you're going to have to sometime. But let's say you decide, I'll just go ahead and play it with a heavy tongue for now. Sometimes time is an issue. You might say to yourself, look, it's going to take me 6 months to learn how to regroup my tonguing. I'm willing to do it, but I just can't do it. So you have decisions like this to make. All right. Then once you've made these decisions, then you say, okay, well, all right, I've done the work. I've got the light tongue. I've got the metronome working. Now I'm going to run through this and see how well that's worked. And so now here is where we get to kind of your question of woodshedding versus running, which we talked about in brass quintet and which I talk about to all of my students. Woodshedding, chunk practicing, spot practicing, whatever you want to call it, is picking little bits of music, sometimes one note, sometimes 3 notes, sometimes one big slur, sometimes a 6-note scale passage, and working it until it's absolutely under control. And that doesn't mean working on it 25 times, getting it right once, and then going on. That means working on it 25 times, getting it right once, and then getting it right 100 times. That kind of minute, precise detail. And that's got to be done, in my opinion, in its own practice time. If you If you do what so many of us do, which is just a version of creative slop, which is to start from the beginning, run until something doesn't work, stop, play it a half a dozen times till it's pretty much okay, and then go on. That's just not ever really going to get you control over that technique. So woodshedding, chunk practicing, spot practicing, really breaking things down, in my opinion, is at the beginning of the day, you sit down and you say, today I'm going to spend 20 minutes, and my plan can get just this finite. I'm going to spend 20 minutes chunk practicing that scale. Come what may, any more is probably going to be a waste of time for today. Any less is not going to be enough time. I'm going to spend 20 minutes on that. In my other solo, I've got a big crescendo in a phrase. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on that. And you may not be as neurotic as I am and put actual time segments to it, but you get my
Well,
point.
if anyone's seen the first couple of videos, they will know that I am quite that neurotic.
Good, and good for you. And yeah, so that's what I suggest doing. Then, okay, so now we're talking about music. So then, what I suggest doing then is flip that switch off, go back to music. You went from a musical concept to how to make it happen practically. Now let's go back and run things. See if it worked. See if it's going to make the music that you wanted to make. Now, running, sometimes people mistake me when I say to run something that I mean run the recital, or that I mean run the concerto, or that I mean run the movement. And sometimes I do, especially later in working on a piece of music. But in the beginning, running simply means play something with a performance mindset from the beginning of what you've chosen to the end of what you've chosen. Running could be one note. Somebody asked Barry Tuckwell one time, what's the hardest note on the horn? And he said, the first one. And I thought, what a fabulous answer, So sometimes running is just putting yourself in a performance mindset and playing that top line pianissimo F that's, an awkward entrance in a piece. Or running could be the 6-note passage that you had woodshedded, maybe the exact same passage. It's just that now you start from the beginning of it, you play to the end of it, you do it with a mindset, you don't stop. Running could be a phrase, it could be a formal section, it could be a movement. But when you're running, and this is true in practicing, and as you know, it's I also teach this in ensemble rehearsals. When you're running, you start with that mindset and you run beginning to end. I don't care if it's fabulous. I don't care if you sound like a pig. I don't care if it's easy. I don't care if it's harder than it was when you first started. You run it, and then you find out how much your woodshedding and your chunking is done. So one more thing, and then I'll be quiet and let you ask some more questions. But one other part of this. Most people tend, when they run something, to run it once, and if it goes really well, pat themselves on the back and go on. I've always said I don't feel good when I play well. I feel good when I play well, and I know why. I know. In other words, I know how to recreate it. And you're only going to do that by, once you've got a definitive version, doing it over and over and over and over again in every circumstance you can imagine. Play it 10 times in a row, or walk in the practice room and play it once. Play it after a 4-hour practice session, play it before you've even warmed up. You need to have these really tricky passages ready under any circumstances whatsoever. And what sometimes happens is once you're that good, once you get it that well, you say to yourself, hey, I've got this. I've got that big crescendo now. But you know what? Now that I've got that big crescendo, maybe I'd like more. Or maybe you've worked out something really fast and you say, all right, I've got this lick at 128 now. And then you look back and you say, but you know what? I really kind of liked it when it was at 104. Let me go back and try that again, or you may run one thing and run another thing and they're both great, but you realize they're not necessarily transitioning into one another very well. So you're always aiming for a definitive answer to what you want, but always keep your mind open. Always be ready to make changes.
Absolutely, yeah. So you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about practice technique and how to get things to happen the way that you want to, and actually establishing those opinions. So was this kind of always the way that you practiced, like maybe through your undergrad, or how did your practice sessions look as you were kind of going through school? And if you could change anything now about that, what would you change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I talked about my former teachers. Boris Ribka, my undergraduate teacher, was really good at teaching this sort of thing. He wasn't quite as detailed and disciplined in his teaching as some are, but he made clear this is what you need to do. You know, again, like I said, Boris was the kind of guy that would howl at the moon when he heard a beautiful musical phrase, but at the same time, he'd say, now you need to play F sharp major scales for 2 hours this afternoon so you can really get them right. And so I learned that kind of early on. Also, a really, really formative influence on me and virtually every other horn player in this country was Phil Farkas's The Art of French Horn Playing. And it was written in the 50s, and it continues to be, in my opinion, the best thing you can read. I have all my students read that book. And he's got several really good chapters on practice, good warm-ups, good technique, you know, how to break these things down. And one of the things that Farkas suggested, and I did religiously for many years, and that I always suggest to my students to do, is to chart your practicing. And he actually has samples of charts in the book. And to keep a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly chart, write down. And I break it down into things like how much time did I spend today on warming up? How much time did I spend on post warm-up techniques? How much did I spend on etudes? How much on solo work? How much on chamber music? How much on this and that and the other? Some people are so specific as to say they're going to spend X amount of time on this etude or X amount of time on that excerpt. I tend not to be quite that specific, but just say etudes, excerpts, solos. And another thing that was really important to me was that at the end of the day, when I totaled up my hours of practicing, I also made an allowance for rehearsing. And I would take, and then underneath, I would subtotal that, and then underneath that, I would put how many hours did I spend rehearsing. And of course, you got to be realistic about this. Sometimes you're in a 4-hour rehearsal and you play 20 minutes, and sometimes you're in a 3-hour rehearsal and you play 2.5 hours. So you have to kind of estimate how much you actually played. But to me, that was important to tell me how my chops were doing, not necessarily, you know, learning the passages, but, you know, how much did I play one day and how did it affect my chops?
Oh, so you can kind of look down at the chart and see, okay, I played this many hours this week, and might be why my chops feel like terrible this morning.
That's right. Yeah. I actually even went so far as to, and this is something that Farkas didn't suggest. This was sort of everything I've said so far I really got from Farkas, but this was sort of my own little take on it, was that at the end of the day, I graded my playing. I graded my playing on a range of 1 to 5, with at 1 being basically an F and 5 being basically an A. And I would even sometimes actually write out a written diary. I didn't do that for very long, but I did grade myself. And yes, you're exactly right. What I would do is at the end of a week or the end of a month, I'd say, oh, wow, I remember that one day I had it going on. And I'd go back and I'd look at that day, and I discovered by looking at months and years, because I did this for years, I discovered by looking at months and years of these charts, there was kind of a pattern as to what I would do in terms of warming up, in terms of doing technical work, in terms of how much rehearsal did I play, and how that would affect my chops. And I could even back up 3 or 4 days and say, you know, what I did on X day added to X day, X day created this. Again, I understand, and I tell this to my students, I know that to a lot of people, this is often neurotic. All I know is it worked for me. And it gave me a real insight into what could make, and almost more importantly, what could not make my chops work.
Sure, yeah. So you're just collecting as many data points as you possibly can.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I feel like that probably makes like the days that you don't feel, you know, 100%, those days that you gave yourself a 1 or a 2, you can almost look down and see, oh yeah, well, it kind of makes sense why I felt that way, and with all this data, rather than looking at a day and being like, wow, my practice sessions were horrible. I wasn't focused. My chops were dead, and then just kind of accepting that and trying to sleep at night.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I think one of the things for me was I realized that there are a lot of people who have that innate ability, the musculature, whatever, to be able to just play great all the time, and it doesn't matter. But I'm not one of those people. And most of my students are not one of those people, and that's okay. We're human. You know, if you're one of those people that doesn't have to worry about this kind of stuff, we're probably not having this conversation anyway. You're already playing in your orchestra, and good for you. God bless you. But for people who are in my studio, you know, you were talking about people who are just, you know, the really exceptional students. You know, what's a characteristic of those people? Again, let me get back to that business of initiative. This is the kind of thing that I count under the word initiative. Is a student willing to do this kind of stuff? And where the charting in particular is concerned, and where the fourfold, oh, by the way, so in my fourfold pattern of practicing, one's creative slop, 2 and 3 are technique and music. The fourth one is obviously when you can put it all together, right? So,
oh, sure, yeah.
So, the people who will buy into that fourfold approach to practicing, I've never heard anybody get worse. I've never heard anybody say it didn't work. Some people will buy into it and they improve tremendously. Some people buy into it and I don't know, they still don't get there, But I can say in all honesty that every student I've ever had who's bought into this, myself included, being my own student, it works. It works to varying degrees, and you have to get like a good recipe to cook with. You got to sort of, mess with it a little bit, but the basic concepts are all the same.
Yeah. Hard work beats talent every day of the week.
I think so. Yeah.
So I guess for my last question, if you had one last piece of advice for young college musicians that just kind of to sum everything up, or talk about something completely different if you want, what would that piece of advice be?
Well, let me say two things which are interrelated. They're basically the same thing. One is, as my teachers told me, learn from anybody, learn from anything, whether it's musical or you can learn to play Brahms Alphorn solos by taking a hike in the mountains. You can learn a lot of what I've learned in terms of physiological practice plans I learned from runners. You can learn from anybody. And then obviously, if a student's having a hard time with the breath, I tell them, hey, go listen to Kirsten Flagstead sing. If they're having a hard time with mellow sound, I say, hey, go listen to Yo-Yo Ma play cello. You can learn from anything. And so sort of the second part of that is experiment. No matter what you think is going to work, do what you think is going to work, but do other stuff, particularly if what you think is going to work doesn't work. If you think you've got it down, add something to it anyway. I use a lot of cooking analogies. Those of us who cook, we've all got those recipes that are hardcore. They work every time. We use them when grandma comes over, but on your own time, throw a little pepper in, substitute one ingredient for the other. Never be afraid to pick and choose from your toolbox, even if you don't necessarily need that tool right at that moment. Even if you're convinced that tool won't necessarily work. I tell people sometimes if you got a crescendo, you can't make work, do a crescendo. Obviously it's the opposite of what you want to do musically, but it'll teach you something about airflow. So just constantly be prepared to experiment with different things and learn from everybody.